Let's talk about this report that you guys did about Wisconsin. Wisconsin had two different primaries, which is
yeah.
or elections, I guess I should say, that were that which is in and of itself just insane. Like that's I guess we have a thing called best practices. That to me seems like worst practices. Forget COVID. Just the idea that you would have like, we're going to do an election a month apart because but talk about why that's the case, and then what that provided a sort of natural experiment too, didn't it? Or at least some I guess maybe research project.
Yeah. So Wisconsin, as many of you know, was really ground zero for the right wing's experiment in just totally dismantling public institutions. And, there was a backlash against that. People in the state consistently have decided, no, that's not what they want. In 2018, Democrats got a majority of the vote for basically everything they ran for. But because the state legislature is so gerrymandered, and because the Supreme Court says that's totally fine, Republicans still hold a very large majority in the state legislature. And so when the governor, Tony Evers, said, hey, we're in the midst of a pandemic, let's try to move these elections out until, people get a little, more health, until the pandemic subsides a little bit, maybe consolidate them. The Republican legislature, which thrives on making sure that people can't vote, said, no, we will not move this Supreme Court election scheduled in April, or we won't move it to mail-in balloting. We're going to force people to vote in person in the middle of a pandemic. And so, they held this state Supreme Court election. It was 2 months. I know it seems like 2 years ago, but it was only 2 months ago that they held this really prominent state Supreme Court election in the midst of the pandemic. And it was supposed to be close. I think heading into election day, people thought the conservative candidate was favored because, again, the state Republican Party refused to move the Republicans in the House refused to move the election date, and people had to vote in person. Democrats take COVID more seriously, according to polls. And so people were really worried that the liberal candidate would lose. But then the election results come in, and she won by 10 points. And we were trying to figure out, well, what happened here? And we saw that there was some backlash to people being forced to vote in person, that they were really angry at the Republicans in the legislature for doing that. And so what we did was that we looked at the counties that had the high, we looked at counties' COVID infection rates, and we looked at the rate at which they shifted from past Supreme Court elections to the current one. And we found that a county with a higher COVID infection rate had a greater shift toward the liberal candidate than counties with lower COVID infection rates. And so that's kind of a wonky way of saying is, the harder hit you were by the pandemic, being forced to vote in person incentivized you more to vote for the liberal candidate. And so more broadly, what we think that means is that if Republicans or Democrats engage in kind of brazen disenfranchisement using the pandemic, or maybe the protests against police brutality, if they use that as kind of a pretext to disenfranchise people, it'll just create a backlash against them. People really hate the idea of their rights being taken, and they will brave those conditions to vote against you if they feel like you're doing that.
That's fascinating. So it's the impingement of or infringement of people's rights that motivates them even more than the candidates themselves. And how does that correlate in Wisconsin? Like, did you have like a racial breakdown to that?
In Wisconsin, it's a mostly white state, so there it's kind of hard to do a racial breakdown. I mean, we did see actually.
Like Milwaukee.
The thing about it is, yeah, and in Milwaukee, I mean, it's kind of tough to do a comparison there, just because it got the worst of the disenfranchisement, but
right.
also
you
don't
went from
have
like
all the data.
100,
we don't have all the data
right.
by race, but I mean, because it is a mostly white state. And so, I mean, this is mostly among white voters that you're seeing this movement.
That's interesting. I mean, just that, having never had any type of lineage or history of having to fight for the right to vote, essentially, for white people, it seems a little bit counterintuitive to me that they would be that sensitive about someone trying to infringe upon their right to do it. But I guess it's just sort of like also lays bare, how nakedly interested in voter suppression the Republicans are. I guess that pisses people off. So it'll be interesting to see if that, because there's going to be, right? I mean, we're going to have either, and it also means to me, as far as I can tell, because that was highly publicized, right? Because you had the legislature do this. I mean, there was a very clear clash between Evers and the Republican legislature, backed up by the Republican Supreme Court. I know, conservative Supreme Court in Wisconsin, state court, and then the Republican one in Washington, D.C. They were all involved in basically limiting people's ability to vote in the context of COVID-19. And it was widely publicized, and it was because there was a fight. And so what it also suggests to me is that Democrats need to make a big fight about this. Otherwise, people won't be activated in the way that you're talking about.
No, that's, I mean, people, it's part of it. I mean, you need a message beyond they're trying to take the vote away from you, obviously. But if there is these efforts at disenfranchisement, letting people know that they are they are being conspired against to be disenfranchised, so that, minority rule can be enshrined in the country, that is something that will galvanize people. And I think what we saw, and to segue into the next election, which was, there was a special congressional election a month later in kind of the northern half of the state. It was far lower profile. Because it was further into the pandemic, they had kind of done a better job of getting mail-in balloting working and figuring out how to have safe in-person voting in a way that just didn't exist in the April election. And so what we saw in that election was the opposite happen, was that in counties that had a higher COVID infection rate, the Democrat actually had the least improvement over prior elections. And that really, it was, and so to us, what that says is, you can't just rely on people being mad about COVID to go out to the polls. In fact, because we think, polls show that Democrats tend to take the pandemic more seriously than Republicans. It'll be harder to get them out in pandemic conditions unless there is some imperative. I think in the November election, because we saw that in other special elections that have occurred during the pandemic that were lower profile elections that didn't get as much news attention, Democrats really underperformed. Now, the November election, I certainly hope that won't be an issue. I think Trump will be unable to soft pedal anything. But it is something to be mindful of, especially more, when Democrats are working within areas where maybe there haven't been blatant efforts to disenfranchise, or reaching out to people who might not be totally excited about the ticket. It really shows you that the pandemic can be a headwind to getting voters out if there isn't something really galvanizing them to go out to the polls.
Good message. I hope somebody's listening, Aaron. Aaron Kleinman, Director of Research at Future Now. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Bye.
Aaron Kleinman, ladies and gentlemen. Let's bring Michael